My wife stepped forward, the blackened soil cracking under the heel of her heavy hiking boots. She sniffed at the stagnant air. "We're here," she exhaled. We had to be. There was no life anywhere. The grass was shriveled and gray, curling up as if to shield itself from the overhead glare of the sun. The barren, spindly trees, long since stripped of all fruit and foliage, undulated back and forth, despite the lack of any breeze. But the most unnerving part was the total lack of noise. No light padding sounds of animals, no chittering or howls. Not even a bird sang. It was as if we had walked into the world's graveyard. I swallowed, trying to push down the aching ball of pressure in my throat. We should never have come to this place. No sane person would. My body ached to turn back, to get as far away from this terrible, forsaken place as we could. Myre, as if sensing my hesitation, snapped around to look at me. Her glare was heightened by the heavy bags that weighed down her eyes from countless sleepless nights. Shame flooded me at my own fear. We had come to this place for a reason. Home felt like another world away. There was no turning back now. I followed my way further into the forest clearing as she pushed the groping branches out of her way, propelled forward by cold, single-minded purpose. She suddenly stopped, letting out a short, sudden breath. I forced myself to look over her shoulder. There in front of us was a small pond, only 6 feet in diameter. In any other context, it would have been a commonplace occurrence, but the water that filled this pond was a deep red, the bitter wind creating wavering circles on its swaying surface. We had found the Devil's Pond. I had grown up on the stories of Devil's Pond and its sole, phantasmal resident. It was the kind that was recounted many times around the glow of a summer campfire, or in the sweat-soaked bustle of high school locker rooms. It had changed so many times over the years that no one knew why the ghost haunted there. One said that she was a young girl accused of witchcraft who had been drowned there by an angry mob. Another purported that she was a known beauty murdered by a spurned suitor who had hidden her corpse there. Like any good ghost, she was supposed to take out her rage on those foolish enough to enter that cursed land. But we weren't going to be her next victims. We were here for a purpose. It was difficult to believe that just a few months ago, I had been cooking dinner while our daughter, Susie, played with her toys in the living room amidst the piling, half-empty cardboard boxes. Despite just being a few weeks shy of her 17th birthday, her My Little Pony dolls remained her pride and joy. Her delivery had been a difficult one. She'd been a breech birth, lodged in the birth canal. She'd been starved of oxygen for almost 5 whole minutes. The doctors had told us that her mind would never mature past the age of 3. Her recent 15th birthday a few months back had been a triumph for us. "All right, Susie Q," I rapped at the edge of the doorway. "Mommy's gonna be home from work soon, so wash up and get ready for dinner." Susie's face lit up. "Okay, Daddy," she chimed. It hadn't been easy, but somehow every trouble was worth it whenever I saw her smile. The world was a constant source of wonder for Susie. Whenever she saw something new or interesting, she'd always rush over to see. The move was supposed to have been a fresh start for all of us, but there was the constant nagging fear of her getting lost exploring our new neighborhood. We'd monitored her like hawks for the past few days, but we'd fallen into a lull as we settled in. It was on that day that I'd forgotten to lock the back door. I was so lost in draining the pasta that I didn't notice the sound at first. I paused over the billowing steam as it became louder, and my daughter's screams clearer. I rushed outside and my heart plunged into my stomach. Susie was surrounded by a baying group of teenagers, 5 in total, 3 boys and 2 girls. They were screaming obscenities at her, her hands clapped to her ears in a desperate attempt to block them out. I charged in like a bull, pulling her away. She clung to me, sobbing into my shirt as I draped my arms around her, trying to shield her from their abuse. Once we got inside, it took an hour for me to calm her down. By then, Myre had returned home from work, still dressed in her gray work blazer. If I was angry, then she was a volcano, spewing forth boiling, unstoppable rage. It turns out, they were a well-known gang around that neighborhood, so getting their names wasn't too hard. Once she had marched over to each of their parents' house and unleashed a verbal barrage. But they didn't seem to care any more than their offspring did. One mother even said it was our fault for not putting her in a home. I had to physically restrain my wife from punching her in the face, even though I was half tempted to let her do so. Once they knew that Susie was different, it had been blood in the water for them, and they descended on us like a pack of ravenous sharks. We had accepted long ago that life would be difficult for Susie, given the inherent cruelty of others. But we had never experienced anything like this before. Our windows would be besieged with eggs and obscene graffiti scrawled across our walls. We didn't have the money to move. The police were no help at all. No matter how many calls we made, they tried to redirect us the bureaucratic way, by filing paperwork. It didn't help that one of the kids' fathers was a prominent citizen who rubbed shoulders with them. Our home had become a fortress, assailed daily by our adolescent tormentors. The worst part was that Susie had no idea what was going on, or why we were living in fear. Was I bad? Was I bad? She sniffled one night from her bed. I bent down to kiss her forehead. No, baby, I told her. You're amazing. These people, the ones who are doing all this, they're the bad ones. There is no worse feeling in the world than knowing that your child is suffering, yet you can't do anything to help them. Yet we lived with it for so long. Then came the night that changed everything. In a rare moment of peace, we had been having a family evening. We had been all huddled up on the couch together watching The Little Mermaid, Susie's favorite Disney movie. She squealed and clapped, her eyes glued to the bright images and catchy tunes that flashed onto screen. I smiled along too, almost forgetting the last few months of hell in the animated fantasy. The quiet had been interrupted by the sound of breaking glass, as a small projectile rolled in through our window and onto the living room floor. The stale odor of alcohol seared the inside of my nostrils. It all happened so fast. Before I could stop her, Susie had reached out to it. The flame skirted up her polyester sleeve and ignited her body. My daughter turned into a shrieking human fireball before my very eyes, slapping at herself with fiery limbs as her skin burnt and crackled, while I stood there, frozen. I will never forget the smell for as long as I live. Like cooked meat. For the next weeks, even the sizzle of baking on a frying pan was enough to make me vomit. It was Myre who had rushed in and smothered the wailing Susie to the floor with a blanket. She looked at me, her brown eyes wide with panicked tears pouring down them, seconds away from completely losing it. "Call an ambulance!" she screamed at me. I managed to regain movement and rush for the phone, all the while Susie's pained howls echoed in my ears. From the half-shuttered windows under the dim streetlights, I saw 5 figures speed into the shadows amidst panicked cries. Susie sustained third-degree burns up to 80% of her body. Even if she had managed to survive, she would have endured years of painful skin grafts and therapy. In the hospital, her hand strained out to touch mine. Her fingernails melted into her flesh by the searing heat. Under the layers of bandage her body was concealed under, I saw a flash of a smile. "Daddy," she breathed, her voice muffled by her oxygen mask. It was the last coherent thing she said before she slipped into a coma and died 3 hours later. The day after the funeral, I found Myre laying on our bed, clutching one of Susie's Rainbow Dash toys to her chest, her eyes puffy and red-rimmed, staring lifelessly at the ceiling. Her fingers twisted its multicolored mane. "I can't do it anymore," she told me. "Just knowing that she's gone, our baby, and those fucking monsters, they're still out there." I pulled myself up beside her, and we both cried together. In the haze of our shared grief, I brought up old memories of the town, and somehow, the topic of the pond had entered the conversation. I told her the stories that had fascinated me, about the few who had been allowed within the ghost domain, kindred spirits who shared in her rage and pain. I have no idea why, but it was probably some misguided attempt at comforting her. It was as if a switch had been flipped. She stiffened, before unwrapping herself from my touch and standing up to full height. Her tears dried. I thought she was joking when she said that we had to find it. The tight-lipped look of resolution that had crossed her face told me otherwise. This had preceded many weeks of reading through old town records, interviewing geriatric residents, and many false starts. There had been arguments and tears. We'd almost given up hope, but that long-burning rage inside of us refused to be snuffed out. Neither Myre nor I could ever die in peace without those responsible for our daughter's death being punished. Suddenly, the surface shifted as a pale head emerged up. with at least a foot of long black hair splaying out around it like the tentacles of an octopus. Pitch-black eyes stared back at us, devoid of any light. Then, just as quickly as it had surfaced, the head shrank beneath the waters. Something brushed against my hand and I jumped a foot in the air, only to see Myre's slender fingers wrap around my own. It brought me back to the first time we held hands as teenagers, when we hadn't a care in the world. As the ripples drew closer, I held her hand like I would never let go. The figure stood up. It was a woman. Her slick, coal black hair sticking to the small of her back and completely naked, but from the ashen neck down, all the skin had been flayed off her body to the point I could count her ribs through the peeling layer of muscle which glistened in the pale daylight. Her disproportionately long fingers were curled at her sides, flexing with each haggard breath. Myre, braver than I could ever be, faced her. "Please forgive us for coming here and disturbing you." Her voice was soft. "But it's our daughter." She unfolded a crinkled photo of a smiling, gap-toothed Susie from the front pocket of her jacket. Just seeing it was enough to tweak the corners of my mouth upward. It was from her 17th birthday, a half-eaten piece of cake still in hand, and the plastic silver tiara she wore half slipping down her forehead as she squinted into the flash. I had been the one who had taken it. My jaw clenched, trying to hold back my own emotions. Her name was Susie. She was just like you. She died before she ever had a chance to live. The shaking piece of paper threatened to slip from her hands as her body was racked with violent sobs, the emotional dam inside of her that stood strong for so long having finally burst. "Please, we'll give you anything to find the ones who did this to her." The figure watched my wife break down in fascinated silence. Her head tilted. It might have been a trick of what faint light permeated through the enclosing trees, but I swore I saw tears gloss its eyes. It hobbled over to her, long fingernails skimming against her wet cheek. "Blood for blood," the figure croaked. I looked to Myre, who nodded back, withdrawing a small knife from the front pocket of her jacket. She slid the serrated steel across her open palm with a pained hiss. The woman lunged towards her. She lashed her mouth onto the seeping wound and started suckling from it like a newborn baby from their mother's breast. Myre only shut her eyes and let it happen, her stoic expression spoiled by telltale twitches of pain in her cheek. When she had her fill, Myre wordlessly handed over the blade to repeat the process, but I heard her voice in the back of my head. "For Susie, everyone has a price, even the undead." The figure retreated, mouth wet with her fresh fill. Her eyes rolled back in an almost vacant fashion, translucent drool stringing from the corner of her mouth. Panic flared up inside me, wondering if we missed a step of the ritual and were now only seconds away from being torn limb from limb. After a rapid series of blinks, it seemed to regain some sanity and rose back to full height. It walked backwards, as if someone hit reverse on the universal remote, their pale, emaciated body being swallowed by red without a single ripple to signify its presence. My wife and I remained rooted to the spot in its dreadful anticipation for something even worse to happen. But the earth around her had returned to its normal, sepulchral state. Myre and I trudged back home in silence. The events of what had just transpired weighed heavier down on us with each step. I stared at the still raw wound slashed across my clammy palm and wondered what we had done. I faced Myre for comfort, but she only looked ahead, oblivious to my distress. The night that followed was a restless one. What precious few hours I managed to sleep were riddled with nightmares. The woman's hideous face seeped into the dreams of my precious daughter, and the two forms had blended together into one horrific amalgamation, who scuttled after me on malformed, crab-like limbs, leaving behind a trail of bloody footprints. I wanted to believe that we'd done the right thing. No one else had been willing to help us get justice, but I couldn't help the feeling that we'd unlocked Pandora's box, and that a plethora of horrors were about to spill out into the world, that we would be helpless to stop. My reservations were proven correct 2 days after we'd visited the creature. We had resettled into a normal, albeit shaky, routine. I had gone to the kitchen for a glass of water, but on turning the tap, there was only a rusty groan. Rolling my eyes, I made a mental note to call the plumber the first thing in the morning, but just as I was about to exit the kitchen, it started to shake wildly, the faucet squeaking up and down on its own as if it were being operated by an invisible hand. The noise was enough to draw Myre from the living room, gaping over my shoulder. We were both sure that the thing was about to explode, and it did. Instead of clear liquid came a torrent of blood that flooded the kitchen sink. Some was even splattered against the refrigerator. We both knew exactly what it was. In my state of shock as I watched the red pool over the marble edge of the kitchen counter, the thing's words ghosted back into my mind. Blood. For blood. Myre stepped out from behind me and made her way towards the kitchen sink, ignoring my inelegant spluttering as I tried to stop her. She soaked her index finger into the miniature red whirlpool for a minute before lifting it up to her gaze, her fingertip glowing like a red macabre ruby. She looked down, almost consumed by the sight, her lower lip quaking. Her mouth stretched into a sickening smile. It was an expression I had never seen on her before, one that made me feel like I was looking at a stranger rather than the woman I loved. Good, she hummed. She flicked it off with her thumb before walking off without another word, leaving me to stare as the flow subsided down the plug hole with a low gargle. The next morning, the first bodies were found, the 5 that had tormented Susie into an early grave. They had been killed in their beds, chalk-white faces twisted into agonized frozen screams, as if they had seen something terrible before they died. There were no signs of a struggle, no ligature marks, nothing that indicated that any of them had died in a natural way. But what really threw the town into a panic was that none of the bodies had a single drop of blood left inside of them. The police think it's a serial killer and have launched an extensive investigation into the case. Only Myre and I know and content to let them think what they want. The farther away they are from the truth, the safer they are. The wound on my palm has reopened and hasn't stopped bleeding since the day of the murders. Even as I type this up, I can see it darken through the fresh plaster I applied to it. She's coming for us. She'll have our blood, just as she had theirs. Myre can't see that, or she refuses to. She still believes that justice has been served. We should have never tried taking it into our own hands. Some part of her died along with Susie, but the true price is much costlier than that. I think of our daughter, waiting in the beyond for parents who will never come, who signed away their souls in a single moment of grief and rage. I'll never see Susie smile again, or hear the gentle tinkle of her laugh, or feel her arms wrap around me. Not in this life or any other. That thought is more painful than whatever awaits us. I only hope that wherever my daughter is now, that she can forgive her stupid father. I've seen hell. It's red, but there's no searing coals or landscapes wreathed in inextinguishable hellfire. It's cool, calculating liquid that encases your body before you even know it, flooding your lungs before pulling you down to join the other unfortunate souls that it's ensnared over the years that rot within its endless deep.